So at this point, we've established that everything in BGP is manual when it comes to forming adjacencies. So I've went ahead and I've just kind of put together a quick configuration that you might see in the real world, something that, just between R1 and R3, again, from R1's perspective, what's a type of configuration that we might see? Okay, now again, we're going to look at this from the perspective of a peer group, but here we're forming with the loopback address of R3, so we need our remote AS, we need our update source loopback 0, but then we're going to go ahead and perform some filtering both in and outbound, right? We're going to go ahead and we're going to apply some BGP attributes here like a password. We're going to go in and we're going to say, local preference, wait, we're going to tweak these different attributes. Now, the thing is that for one neighbor, there's not a whole lot of value add here, right? So if I'm just peering between these two neighbors, not a real big deal to go ahead and type in these 7 commands. But what if I'm peering between R1 and 2, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 1 and 7, and I need to type in the same set of commands every single time? That can be very time consuming and it's not very productive. It's like, do you really want to waste 2 hours of your day going in and typing all these different commands multiple times? And the answer is no. I don't know any network engineer that's going to want to go ahead and do that. And so what peer groups do is peer groups allow us to form a template. And so what we can do in a peer group is we can bring all of these commands, the remote AS, we can bring all of this stuff, all the filtering underneath this template umbrella. Please forgive my umbrella drawing here, okay? So we can bring all these commands underneath this configuration template or umbrella, and then what we can do is we can add our neighbors underneath that umbrella, and what's going to happen is that all of our neighbors that are underneath this template are going to automatically get those settings that we are applying. Now, there's a few things that we need to understand when it comes to forming a peer group. There's 3 bullet points here that I'm going to write down that I don't want you guys to essentially forget, okay? All of our members here, so I'm going to say all neighbors need, or all neighbors should share, actually, well, they do need to share, but I'll say should share the same outbound policy, okay? So the problem here that we come across is that if we are going to filter outbound like here, or the local preference here, all of our neighbors should, or they really need to, if you try to apply another outbound policy, once the neighbor is inside of the peer group, it's not going to let you. And if you apply an outbound policy to a neighbor, and then you put the neighbor in the peer group, it'll go ahead and remove it for you. I'll show you that as long as I don't forget. Okay, let me actually just put this here, outbound policy, so I don't forget. I'm just going to say outbound policy. This way I don't forget to show you. Okay, so the next bullet point here that I want you guys to remember is that after this, then you can change inbound policies. So you can change inbound policy maps or whatever it is that you're doing, okay? You can change your inbound policy on a per neighbor basis if you wish, okay? You can also change custom attributes like the remote AS. Okay, so what I mean by that is here, I've gone in and I've said that this remote AS is 13. If this was a peer group, so instead of a neighbor here, if this was a peer group, okay, I could go in and I could assign a manual autonomous system to an individual neighbor and then assign him to the peer group, and he would still get all of the rest of these individual commands within the peer group, but he would be in a separate autonomous system, if you will, okay? Now, the one thing that's kind of a mix, and when I say this, it's kind of this weird, people kind of tweak their heads like a dog because you say, well, why would you change that remote AS? Some people, it's not best practice. You really shouldn't do that because the third bullet point is that eBGP and iBGP should not be mixed. Be mixed. Okay, meaning that you should not have a peer group here, so I should not go in and say neighbor whatever, blah, 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 and then say remote, 27, or 32 or whatever, right? I just messed that up, but you get the point, right? So this guy should never have a different remote autonomous system than what you're putting into in the peer group. If you're going to have neighbors that have different autonomous systems like this, then you're better off just leaving out. Let me erase the screen here. You're better just leaving out that remote autonomous system command altogether and just assigning maybe your filtering attributes. Maybe your peer group is going to be called filter because all you're doing is adding your filtering and maybe security. So maybe your peer group is called filter_security, and you add your password and your filters, but manually assign your remote ASs, because you really don't want to ever mix your IGP and your eBGP. Okay, there are some people who kind of figure out some weird combinations there, and they get it working, but then they call Cisco, a month later and say, well, this isn't working in BGP and we have no idea why, or they call their partner and say, well, this isn't working and we have no idea why, because somehow you tweaked BGP in a way that it's not supposed to be tweaked. So peer groups allow us to group this all together. Okay, so I want to just give you that background here before we just jump into the CLI and get it going. So here's how we're going to configure this. So we're going to use ASN 13 over here. All right, so we'll use 13 between R1 and 3, and then between R3 and 5, we'll use ASN 35. Okay, so this guy here is going to be called iBGP. We'll call this peer group here eBGP. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get this configured. I do have a static route. We are going to form. Let me note that in too also. This way you guys don't get confused. We are going to go ahead and form with the loopback 0 interface here on these devices. So if I wake up R1, let's say ping 3.3.3, and we'll say source loopback 0, and we have reachability. So let's go ahead and get BGP configured. So router, BGP, we're going to say 13, BGP router ID. You guys know that this is my habit. Okay, so now instead of neighbor and adding in this neighbor address, normally I would go in and I would say neighbor address, right? And I would add that destination IP address. What I'm going to use is this neighbor tag or word. And what are we going to call it? iBGP. Okay, and now all I need to do is enter in this peer group command and define my peer group. So that's really all I need to do to actually set up a peer group. Now I need to apply all those individual commands to the actual peer group, not the neighbor. And where I normally start with this is the shared config. Okay, so whatever config my neighbors are going to share, that's where I start. Are they going to share a remote autonomous system? I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just going to share some distribute lists, right? I don't know what they're going to share. The point is that I start with that common configuration that I know that they're going to share. Okay, so we're going to say remote AS 13. We'll go ahead and we'll say distribute list to in. We'll go ahead and we'll say route. By the way, guys, none of this really exists. All I'm doing is I'm adding some bulk to our configuration here so that we can see essentially where a peer group is going to save us some time, right? Oops, can't do that in. Do show run section router BGP. So now instead of assigning all these different commands to an individual neighbor, so let me go back over to the notepad that we had open. Here was the notepad that we had. Instead of assigning all these different attributes here to the neighbor, what we're doing is we're assigning it to the individual, instead of assigning it to the individual neighbor, we're assigning it to a group. We're assigning it to a peer group, right? Now, this is great for administration. Maybe you have, a network engineer who's not really familiar with BGP. They really don't feel comfortable with it, but you're a whiz. Peer groups are a great use case for that. So you can set up a group and you can just teach, your network engineer one command, and that's the command to join the neighbor to the peer group. So all we're going to do is say neighbor 3.3. I'm going to say peer group, and that's all I got to do. Do show run section router BGP. So auto-magically here, I'm going to try and form a peering with 3.3.3.3, and every one of these settings in this peer group are going to be applied to this neighbor when it comes up. Now, I did say that you could change the remote autonomous system, but sometimes engineers come in and they try this afterwards and they get this error message and they're like, well, JP said you can do this. Yeah, you can, but you've already added the neighbor to the peer group, and that's where you error out. So if I remove this guy from the peer group, and I go in and I add him separately as an individual neighbor, and I go in and apply the peer group again, do show run section router BGP. Now he's going to go ahead and have his own custom autonomous system, and everything else he will be using that peer group for. Okay, but this is not a really good idea. Now, the other thing is I can go in and I can apply some individual filtering here. I can say distribute list 3 in, okay? But I want you to see what happens if I try to apply something additional outbound. Distribute list 4, let's say out, it's going to bark at me, okay? So do show run section router BGP. It doesn't let me apply that filter. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this real quick. And by the way, there's a lot of different things that you guys are going to learn about peer groups as you start to configure them and play with them. You're going to learn, I can't do this command when this has already happened. I can't do this. I can't do that. Oh, I have to do this first. I don't have, I don't want to have a 3-hour video to go through all of that with you, because, that spoils the fun for you guys. You guys have to go in and learn this stuff, and go through it. I'm just showing you, I'm giving you the launch point, if you will, in how to create these peer groups. Now, if I go in and I say neighbor 3.3.3, and let's say distribute list 3 out. Actually, this is going to bark at me because I didn't add the remote AS first. So let's go in and do this. Do show run section router BGP. So now I've applied this outbound filter to neighbor 3. But now if I go in and I say neighbor, and I'm really lazy here, I want to do everything on the mouse. That's why I'm just double clicking. So now I've added neighbor 3 to the peer group, and notice how I had this distribute list out, right? So I was performing a different outbound filtering than what was already assigned in the peer group. Do show run section router BGP. You can see that that outbound filter that I placed on here was stripped off. Okay, so you guys have to be careful, and you guys have to know all these little different things of how these peer groups are going to act. Okay, but the basic premise here, the point that I want to drive home, is the idea that it's going to save us a ton of time and a ton of typing by grouping all these things together and coming up with a template. So what I'll do is I'll add neighbor 3 here to the peer group. By the way, peer groups also open us up to something called a dynamic listen range, which is really cool. I'll have a separate 10-minute video on that. That's really, really cool. That's one of my favorite features. So now we have this built-in BGP. So let's head over to R3. Let's say config T router BGP 13, BGP router ID, we'll say 3.3.3. Now, I could be really, really lazy and come in and just copy and paste this whole thing, but you guys are learning, and I want you to make sure that you know how to do it. So I'm going to say neighbor IBGP peer group, neighbor IBGP, and I'm going to say remote AS 13. Actually, I will cheat a little bit. So we'll highlight that and just keep double clicking, or right clicking. We'll say distribute list 1 in, neighbor IBGP distribute list 2 out. We'll say route map. We won't do them all because you guys get the idea right now. So we'll say local pref in. Okay, so do show run section router BGP. So we have this IBGP peer group. I actually forgot one, and that's our update source. So we'll say loopback 0. Let's check our config. Okay, so now at this point, all we should really have to do is add our neighbor to the peer group. So we'll say neighbor 1.1.1, and I'm going to say peer group, and then just simply double click here, right click to paste it, do show run section router BGP, and that looks good. Okay, let's see what's going on. So we'll say do ping 1.1.1 source loopback 0. We have reachability. I was just checking because I didn't see this come up right away, so I just wanted to make sure we didn't have anything broken. But you can see our adjacency comes up. Let's say do show IP BGP summary, and we have an adjacency. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's configure a second peer group on R3 that goes over to R5. So we'll say neighbor E BGP, and I'm going to say peer group neighbor E BGP, and I'm going to say remote AS 35. Do show run section router BGP. And just because I want to go ahead and have some fun, I will go ahead and apply some of these individual, some of these additional features here for, and again, I'm just playing around here. Some of this stuff really would make no sense if I was doing it, like the local preference. Well, that's inbound, so that would make sense. Do show run section router BGP. All right, so now I've defined this peer group here for R5. Now all that's really left for me to do is go in and say 10.3.5.5. This is the destination IP address of R5. We're going to peer with this directly connected interface, and all I'm going to do is say peer group, and we forgot the P, so we'll go in and say P, and go to the end here. Didn't really save myself any time whatsoever, and apply it to that external peer group. Take a look at our config. So we're gonna form an adjacency with 35. We're gonna perform some filtering. We're gonna set the local preference for any prefix sent inbound, and we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna apply this particular neighbor to that peer group. So on R5, let's just get a basic configuration done just to make sure that we can actually prove that this is going to work. So router BGP 35, neighbor 10.3.5.3, remote AS 13, and that should be it. We should get adjacencies here momentarily. There we go. And we have a full adjacency. So let me just go back here and just show you this config one last time, guys. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to come in, you're going to say neighbor, and then you're going to pick a name. That name could be whatever, if you're taking any type of networking exam, whatever, the exam tells you to use, or if you're in the real world or the exam doesn't tell you, you can choose whatever in the world you want. Phil's or Joe's prefix, filter list or whatever. Who cares what the peer group's going to be called? So you go in, you define the peer group name with the peer group, and then you're going to give all of your attributes to that peer group. And then lastly, all you need to do is still enter that individual neighbor statement. This statement here is something you can never get away from, because BGP, well, that's not entirely true, but for now, that you won't be able to get away from, because BGP at this point in your learning needs to know who he's going to try to form an adjacency to. So I hope you learned something in this video, guys. Hope this took your fear away with peer groups, and I will see you guys in the next video.